Deadwood, South Dakota, once the black heart of the Old West. Hidden under its modern streets lie traces of a city of sin. A place peopled by gunslingers, outlaws, whores, and gold prospectors. A city that would be consumed by fire. Our investigators are traveling back to the time when Deadwood was born.
130 years ago, I'd be stepping knee-deep into mud, manure, and sewage.
They'll walk streets that were meaner than any in modern America. They'll enter a maze of abandoned mines. They'll explore the technology the prospectors use.
So what they do is they take this hammer, this hand steel, smash away at the rock.
They'll follow the tunnel that eventually brought order to a town that lives on chaos. Using original documents and the very latest archaeological evidence, they will rebuild the lost world of Deadwood, Sin City of the West. These are the Black Hills of South Dakota. They rise up from the Great Plains of the Midwest. In the summer of 1874, this was a place of peaceful woods and rivers. But the peace would soon be gone. Within 2 years, the town of Deadwood had exploded into existence. These hills became a battleground, and the reason was gold. Our investigators Chris Murley and Sherry Monahan are here to uncover the world created by Deadwood's gold rush. Chris is a mining technology expert. He explores and maps abandoned mines.
What I want to do is find out how they extracted the gold from the hills and how they transported it out of here.
Sherry is a Wild West historian. She wants to find out what was here on the eve of the gold rush and to reconstruct how it all began.
It's hard to imagine that in 1874 there was nothing here but wilderness. By the fall of 1875, there were clear indications of a mining camp. In the spring of 1876, the town of Deadwood had sprung up. I really want to know what got this all started.
The town you see today has undergone massive transformation. The creek that men once mined for gold has been covered over, and the city of legend has been destroyed by fire. Sherry has heard that explorers came looking for gold long before the rush of 1874. Her first port of call is at Deadwood's museum, where she meets curator Arlette Hansen.
Do you have any evidence that shows life here before the gold rush?
There's actually quite a bit.
Great.
One of the most important ones is this. It's called the Thone Stone, which records in sandstone the story of 7 men who came out here in 1833.
Wow. That's quite a lot before the Deadwood rush.
Yes.
This stone was discovered in the 1870s. Pioneers found it on a wooded slope 10 miles from Deadwood. The man who carved the words failed to make it out alive. This rock became his tombstone.
So what happened to them?
Well, it reads, got all of the gold we could carry, our ponies, all got by the Indians. I have lost my gun and nothing to eat, and Indians hunting me.
Explorers braved the hills in their quest for gold. But this territory was not part of the United States. It was American Indian land. According to the Fort Laramie Treaty between the U.S. government and the American Indians, the Black Hills belonged to the Lakota tribe. The hills were sacred to the Lakota. Their warriors would kill to defend them. And the U.S. military had promised to keep settlers away. There should have been little to attract them. It was an empty land with bitter winters. The terrain was tough. It had no roads. It was hard to get in. It was hard to get out. But the few that tried and succeeded brought tales of gold.
This is a great collection of maps. Can you sort of tell me what the area looked like before the great gold rush happened?
There wasn't much here. As you can tell by this map, the Missouri River was the edge of America. Here are townships and counties all laid out and named, and on this side of the Missouri River, it's empty. There's nothing there except rivers and the Black Hills.
the United States effectively ended 200 miles to the east of the hills, across the Great Plains.
Now, this was Indian territory, correct?
Yes, it was.
And right smack in the middle is Deadwood.
Yes.
That must have posed a problem with the military obviously protecting Indian land, and yet there's still people coming in.
Absolutely.
So what caused people to trespass on Indian land?
Oddly enough, the military.
In the summer of 1874, a new force came riding into the mountains. It was headed by Lieutenant Colonel Custer. He wasn't there to protect Lakota territory. Far from it. His was a military reconnaissance mission. In a creek 56 miles south of where Deadwood now stands, they panned for gold. When they found it, they saddled up and rode away. Word spread throughout a country in the grip of the worst economic depression that it had ever known. The stampede towards the Black Hills began. In less than a year, 4,000 gold diggers had arrived. Still operating outside the law, they made their way to what is now Deadwood Gulch. They built a rough encampment of tents and cabins. Its layout can still be seen in the streets of today's town. And because the hillsides were covered in old trees and dry brush, they called the valley Deadwood.
With all these people out here, you know, there were obviously Indians still here. Did anybody do anything to protect the people who were obviously coming out of here in masses to search for gold?
Yes, actually General Custer came back.
Oh, now he comes.
He came back to protect the settlers at this point by fighting the Indians.
And obviously a large battle ensued after he came out here. It was a little clash.
Yes, the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
The number of prospectors increased. The Indians intensified their attacks. A showdown was inevitable. The Battle of the Little Bighorn would go down in history. Here, on June 25, 1876, Custer's troops faced a larger force of better trained, better armed warriors. He died along with all of his men. And yet for the Indians, victory proved disastrous. The U.S. response was to pour men and guns into what was now a full-blown war. By the end of the year, the Lakota Indians were forced to sign over their Black Hills territory to the federal government. Deadwood acquired legal status as a settlement. That didn't make it a safe place to travel to. The Lakota continued a brutal guerrilla campaign against new settlers. But still, the prospectors kept coming. In 1878, 15 miles east of Deadwood, the Army responded by building Fort Meade. It was strategically located at a point where 3 of the trails into Deadwood converged. And it sat at the bottom of a valley in the shadow of Bear Butte, a mountain the Lakota Indians held sacred. Up above the fort, Sherry meets historian Chuck Rambo.
Now, I imagine for me personally, if I was coming in here on one of these trails, I'm coming into Indian country, and I know there's a fort here, but, you know, what happened on the trails? I mean, did I have a reason to have fear?
They were reasonably safe if they stayed with a large group, but only with a large group. It was very slow travel. Many of the people are walking, and then at night, of course, you have to go out and get firewood, you have to kill game for food, and that means that you have to leave the caravan. When that happens, you're fair game.
In terms of brutality, I mean, what happened to somebody when they were attacked?
The Indians have their techniques of taking scalp. The scalping is a very simple process. Just kind of pull back on the hair and you've got the scalp. And it is proof that you have taken a trophy.
These were fear tactics, but they couldn't deter men who thought they were about to get rich. And an established military base at Fort Meade would give them confidence. Chris, our engineering investigator, wants to see if he can find clues that will allow him to rebuild the original fort.
So Chuck, we have this wide open space. This doesn't look like any fort I've ever seen before. In my image of forts against the Indians, you'd have stockades and towers and walls, and it's down in a valley with the mountains above it. Seems like a low spot. Doesn't make sense for a good position to me.
The perimeters never had a fort, actually. The federal posts depended upon the men to defend the post, not the walls, not the stockade.
Up to 23 officers and 750 soldiers occupied the fort, a formidable proposition for the remaining bands of Lakota Indians. There were no fortifications, but there was a set plan to these cavalry forts, and they were constructed with military precision.
So Chuck, this is the original map from 1879.
This is the actual blueprint of that period of time. And this is the building. We're standing next to the very old commissary building, which was erected late 1878, completed in 1879.
And this is the only original building?
This is pretty much the only original building on the entire perimeter.
The other original structures have been destroyed, but this one building may help us recreate the fort that protected Deadwood.
Oh, look at how extensive this is. This goes for the whole length of the building.
It's very, very large. It was an old root cellar used for storage.
Look at the brickwork. I thought all these buildings were wood. Why was this made out of brick?
This is much more permanent. It's planned to last.
So they must have known that this building was going to be here for a long time.
That was the plan. The fort was to be a permanent military post.
It's possible to build a very accurate picture of the fort built to subdue this territory. Officers' housing lined one side of a central parade ground the size of 28 football fields. On the other lay stables, storehouses, and the barrack rooms for the troops. Our investigators have learned of the risks that every prospector took in traveling to the Black Hills. But when those pioneers arrived, they'd find they were on their own, and the battle for survival only just begun. The gold mines held dangers greater than any attack. In 1875, gold rush fever turned the tranquil Black Hills of South Dakota into a frenzy of activity. Bursting with opportunists, the town of Deadwood became America's ultimate frontier town. Our investigators have recreated the fort that protected the new settlement against American Indian attacks. Now, they will reconstruct how the last pioneers of the West made their fortunes. They'll rebuild the powerful machines they used. The first pioneers in Deadwood staked their claims and set about panning for gold. A few prospectors did strike it rich in the creeks. In 1876, the lucky ones panned $1.5 million worth of gold in the Black Hills. That's $50 million today. But most were doomed to disappointment. Panning wasn't enough. The men who knew what they were doing headed into the hills, knowing the gold in the creeks must have washed down from somewhere. They discovered America's richest gold seam 3 miles west of Deadwood. Over the next 124 years, miners would dig 40 million ounces of gold out of this seam. That's over $26 billion in today's money. Chris meets mining historian David Wolf at the Homestake Mine.
So this is a huge hole. What exactly is this?
Well, this is the Homestake open cut. This is where the entire Homestake mining operation started, from this very location. Over the years, this hole has expanded to be as large as you see it.
Wow, that's amazing. It looks like they dug out an entire mountain here. You can see on each side where the mountain once was, and now it's gone.
At first, miners dug out the surface of the mountain, creating a narrow cut or wedge into its slopes. It stretched for a mile. And this is what they were looking for.
This black rock combined with this quartz. The quartz would come to the surface. In it would be the gold.
Oh wow, look, you can see it right there.
Miners also started digging underground. They created a honeycomb of tunnels and shafts. Eventually, it weakened to the point where it completely collapsed. Mining in the 1980s dug out the rest of the network. And what is left is this 1,250-foot crater.
I see all these holes peppered along the side. It looks like Swiss cheese. Was that part of a mine at one point?
Well, of course, these tunnels you see here are actually from about the 1880s.
Wow, that's great. So we're looking at the original first tunnels. So there was a huge underground operation here.
These holes are all that remain of the early mines. David takes Chris to have a closer look at a tunnel that leads 150 feet below ground.
Well, Chris, welcome to the Homestake Gold Mine.
Oh, excellent. This is great.
It goes in quite a ways. This goes way in back to the hillside.
Okay, so how far were the workings in this mine? How far down did it go?
If you follow this mine to the deepest,
Okay.
it goes down to 8,000 feet.
That's insane. 8,000 feet down.
The Homestake would ultimately become the deepest gold mine in the Western Hemisphere. But in the early days, they were blasting out tunnels closer to the surface. And they got the rock out in horse-drawn trucks.
And as you notice, this appears to be coming downhill.
Okay.
And that's so that when you have a loaded ore train coming out, it coasts downhill very nicely, and then your empties come back much more easily.
Oh, so it's easier to haul the heavy cars out.
Exactly.
The tunnel slope has another advantage.
Okay, so all this water dripping down and ending up in the tunnel. What would happen with that? I mean, this is awful wet in here. We're stepping
Well, of course,
into
the water is natural. Many mines are wet, and they collect water all the time. And here, when it runs downhill, with this tunnel runs downhill slightly, it'll drain out naturally.
Flooding in the tunnels could be deadly.
Some areas deeper in the mine, they've got to pump the water out. The bottom pipe is used for pumping out the water out of the deeper portions of the mine.
The deepest parts are now completely flooded, and the oldest parts of this mine are far too unstable to enter. Yet it's still possible to see how the early miners worked. David takes Chris to the outskirts of Deadwood, to the Broken Boot Mine.
So this is what I'm used to seeing here, is a timber set like this. These are used commonly in all mines to support the tunnels.
The miners' greatest fear was a cave-in. And yet timber supports were all they had to hold up thousands of tons of rock.
Watch out.
They worked their way along these cramped, dark tunnels with only candles to light the way. Then, by hand, they'd bore holes for blasting.
So what they do is they take this hammer, this hand steel, and they smash away at the rock.
Yep.
Quarter turn every time.
That's right.
We're not getting anywhere fast.
Well, you got to get all the way in.
Doing this alone, a miner would spend 4 hours drilling a 2-foot hole.
Now, there's an easier way to do that. Sometimes you have two guys working at it. You're single jacking. Sometimes they would double jack, where one fellow would hold the drill, another fellow would be swinging the hammer.
You must have a good buddy then behind you.
You better be good friends.
Excellent.
The miners would set the charges, retreat, then light the fuse. It was a process that, over the years, claimed dozens of lives.
Wow, look at this hole. What exactly are we looking at here, Dave?
In a gold mine, you'd call this a stope. The miners would drive their tunnels to get to this kind of spot where they thought this was the gold vein was, and they dig this out to take the gold ore out.
Amazing.
50 feet high, 35 feet wide, and 180 feet long. This was a death trap.
How would they support something like this?
Most stopes this large would be square set timber. They'd start building cubes of pillars of timbers, working from one layer to another. It added security and it added an area to work.
10-foot-long timbers were cut to interlock with one another. It was a design intended to make the framework simple to erect. We can now reveal what the tunnel network at the Homestake mine once looked like. Tunnels were dug off shafts 800 feet deep. At one stage, miners were removing 900 tons of gold ore a day. It made the land the Deadwood stood on the richest 100 square miles on Earth. Chris wants to find out where the gold ore was processed at the surface. No buildings survive intact, but there is some evidence in the forest beyond the Homestake mine.
So, Dave, tell me what we're looking at here.
Well, Chris, we're looking at a set of stamps. The stamp mills were the most predominant type of crushing machinery throughout the West. You'd harvest the ore out of a mine, you'd mine the ore, you've got to crush that rock to get the gold out of it, and that's what these stamps did.
The ruins of this machine now lie collapsed across the slopes.
40 stamps per mill were probably pretty common.
So you have 1,000 pounds of this steel lifting up and down and smashing the ore.
These machines worked on steam power. A belt drove a shaft that rotated curved teeth. They would raise the 1,000-pound stamp rods and allow them to fall onto the rock.
The stamp would be right here.
Right.
What exactly do we have with this?
This is an ore feeder. Behind the stamp would be your ore bin. This ore feeder would regulate the flow of the ore into the stamp process. This is the mortar area, and the stamps would be sitting right there. Over there where the shoes were connected to the stamps would crush the ore right on this die.
The rocks that entered this trowel were pulverized by the stamps. 40,000 pounds of iron worked around the clock, smashing ore into dust. It took up to 4 tons of rock to make only 1 ounce of gold. The hills around Deadwood rang with the sound of these machines.
So the whole town could hear the vibration of the stamping and the crushing of the rock.
So over 1,000 of these things running at once. That sound must have been deafening.
That's the sound of prosperity, the sound of money, the sound of jobs.
And when the miners earned their gold, they were quick to spend it. Next, we rebuilt the place that claimed their cash, and sometimes their lives, the Badlands of Deadwood. In the 1870s, mining for gold in the hills around Deadwood could see you get rich, but it could also see you get killed. Our investigators have revealed the risks that prospectors ran in pursuit of their dreams. Now, they will uncover the dangers they faced when they went to spend their money. They did it in a part of town called the Badlands. Sherry Monahan meets museum director Mary Kopko.
You know, it's hard to believe that this was such a rough and rowdy place back in the day.
Well, it really was truly a raucous place to be. You have to remember that people were here illegally. They were outside of the law. And in fact, the newspaper even suggested that they change the name from Deadwood to Dead Man. There were about 34 murders in the first couple of years and probably about 90 violent deaths.
That's a murder rate more than 30 times higher than even the most dangerous of our cities today.
Most of the men here were packing pistols. They were trying to protect their claims, and they often would get into disputes. They'd be drunk playing poker or gambling, and they would settle their disputes with a pistol.
In a dangerous town, the saloons were the most dangerous places of all. One of them was the scene of Deadwood's most famous murder. Wild Bill Hickok may have been a legendary sharpshooter, but even he became a victim, and there was nothing glamorous about his death. While playing poker in saloon number 10, he was shot in the back of the head by a man that he'd beaten at cards. Hickok's name made the story news, but in Deadwood, this was every day. Business as usual. And all of the bars were concentrated in one part of town. The center of Deadwood was split into 2 areas, the main commercial district in the south and the Badlands in the north.
If you cross this line right here, you would be stepping into the Badlands.
So if I take a couple steps over here, I'm pretty much entering purgatory?
And you would be risking life and limb.
And this is what it would have looked like. The original Badlands has been destroyed, but at one point, there were 75 saloons in a stretch no longer than a football field. Perhaps the roughest street America's ever seen. Its beginning was marked by the most notorious of all its saloons. The Gym Theater. Drinking house, dance hall, gambling den, and brothel. A one-stop shop for vice and violence. It was destroyed by fire in 1899 and never rebuilt. Sherry meets archaeologist Jerry Bryant, who excavated the site in 2000.
What did you find in the dig that could tell us a little bit more about the gem?
Well, inside, as soon as you went in, the front door here, on the right-hand side, you would see the saloon bar, about 25 feet long. Back in the back would have been the dance hall. It would have been a large hall. It was set with theater chairs that were movable, and in the back of that would have been a stage. And that's where they would have plays, or you'd have dancing girls. On the second floor was a balcony all the way around, which were all enclosed little booths. And that's where the girls would take their boys.
And they would...
hanky-panky.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
The gym handled entertainment like an industry. It provided liquor at the bar downstairs and women, both on the stage and in private upstairs cubicles. The promise of gold attracted men and women from all over the world. But archaeologists have discovered that one community in particular left its mark on Deadwood's Badlands, the Chinese. Sherry meets archaeologist Chris Leatherman.
You know, standing here in the middle of downtown Deadwood, it's hard to imagine that there was a Chinatown here. Can you tell me about it?
Chinatown here was the largest Chinese town in the northern Black Hills, about 140 people.
Wow, so, you know, how did they earn a living here?
Well, initially they began off mining, but they moved into the service industries, restaurants, laundries.
So they kind of mined the miners, I guess.
Yes, they were, and they were making a very good living at doing that.
A Chinese laundry turned over more money in a day than the average miner. And many of the establishments doubled up as brothels and opium dens.
Well, according to this map, it appears that we're right about on the edge of Deadwood, and it almost seems to be Chinatown is down there on the outskirts of town.
The heart of Chinatown's about 300 feet or 100 meters that way.
Once on the north edge of the Badlands, Chinatown has been completely destroyed. The area is now a parking lot. But between 2003 and 2005, archaeologists began to dig where Chinatown once stood. And here, in what was the heart of the Wild West, they found a Chinese temple or Joss house. They also found hundreds of artifacts.
It's probably one of the most special artifacts, not just from the Joss house, but from the site itself.
Oh, well, can't wait to see this.
All right. This is what's called a tea or liquor warmer.
Wow.
Now this is the only vessel like it that we found on the site.
Okay.
And this is probably a ceremonial object that would have been used by the entire Chinese community.
Built into the steep valley slopes, the Joss house was the focus of the Chinatown community. Its oriental balcony made it unlike any other building in the Black Hills. The town was a colorful mixture of characters from around the world. The prospectors and miners of Deadwood rubbed shoulders with outlaws, whores, gamblers, and gunslingers. The Badlands, their seedy underworld, would ensure that Deadwood became known as Sin City. But its glory days would soon be over. The Badlands would be wiped from the earth in a single night of devastating fire. Deadwood, South Dakota. These streets hide traces of the Wild West Sin City. But in 1879, something hit town that would sweep away everything. Fire. Our investigators have recreated the violent crime district, the Badlands. Now, they want to find out what the rest of the old town looked like on the eve of its destruction. They will track its development through a period of violent change. Sherry meets Mary Kopko.
Just how devastating was this fire to Deadwood? I mean, how far did it spread?
It was huge. It spread throughout the entire commercial district. It was completely wiped out. The whole town was built of wooden structures.
The fire started in Sherman Street, south of the commercial district.
Then it ended up progressing to a hardware store where there had been dynamite, and when that blew up, the whole town blew up.
The flames spread north, destroying 300 businesses. The Badlands was leveled. 2,000 people lost their homes. They came up to this hillside to watch everything they'd built disappear.
If I'm one of these poor people, I have poured my hopes, my dreams, and my money into this town, and I can do nothing but stand here and watch it go up in smoke. What am I going to do next?
It was devastating, and yet these people were tenacious. They very quickly rebuilt this community. Within 4 hours after the fire burned out, they were down there mining the ash for gold dust so that they could rebuild. Many of the buildings on Main Street that you see today were constructed in 1879.
The original town was built in a hurry, but the timber that made rapid construction possible also made Deadwood vulnerable. Chris visits a local lumber yard. He wants to find out how the first buildings in Deadwood were constructed.
So see, what we have here is a log cabin. This looks pretty modern with the tools and what we have here. What would be the difference between this now in today's technology and what would have been used back in the day in the late 1800s?
Probably the size of the logs. In the old days, they had to do this mostly by hand. You know, this is probably about the size of the logs used in those days. You can see, compare, we use just a little bigger logs now. And the other thing too, usually they didn't go very high. We usually go 8 foot, 9 foot, 10-foot walls. There, they would just enough to get in. Sometimes you have to duck into the doorways.
So in the beginning, it was just keep it simple, get the houses up, get the people in, living, and mine that gold.
Yes, that's right. They didn't go any higher than they had to, just so they get in there.
The log cabins were strong, simple structures. Lumber was readily available. This afforded protection from winter cold and Indian attacks. The tools used to process the timber then are still used today.
This is what we use to peel our logs now.
Chris uses tools like this to repair wooden supports in abandoned mines.
That seems, give it a go at that?
Yeah, sure. It seems a little bit different than what I'm used to using, but it's, I guess, about the same idea. Want to get this bark off so that the timber doesn't rot from the inside out.
Right. Now you know why the settlers left most of the bark on.
Yeah. This is working pretty good, though.
Yeah.
As the town became more organized, sawmills were set up and the logs were cut into boards. These made timber buildings even faster to put up. The first structures to go up after the fire were still built in this way. They show what the early town would have looked like before disaster struck.
Are these some of the buildings, or is this one of the buildings that you mentioned?
Yeah, actually, this was one of the first structures that went up right after the fire, as did this structure right here. They're both frame buildings, too.
Wow, they're great. And I noticed that these two are right smack up against one another.
Well, you can see what caused the devastation of the fire, because in every nook and cranny there was a wooden structure in the commercial district, and so they would quickly go up in flames.
Sort of like a domino effect. One goes and the rest just start going
Absolutely.
down.
The buildings had to stand close together. 500 of them were squeezed between the creek and the slopes into an area no larger than 6 football fields. We can now reveal what the center of Deadwood looked like before the fire of 1879. Timber frame structures and log cabins crowded Main Street. Wooden boardwalks lined the roadsides. The fire transformed how most people built in Deadwood. They would build not in wood, but in brick and stone.
So this building here, is that something that would have been typical that would have gone up after the fire?
Yes, in fact, ironically, it's named the Phoenix Building because it quite literally went up out of the ashes.
Now, the brick that's made of, is that local? I mean, is that something that is native to the area?
Yes, it is. After the fire, the residents of Deadwood established a brickyard here in town.
So it made it pretty easy to build brick and be a little safer?
Yes.
Well, that's a pretty good idea.
It is now possible to show the great transformation that Deadwood went through. In just over a decade, the settlers conquered the wilderness. First with a mining camp of tents and cabins beside the creek. Then a timber town with the same main street. Finally, they built a city of brick. The respectable new look of Deadwood reflected a change in the town's very character. In many ways, the fire marked the death of the old, lawless Deadwood. But it was one particular feat of engineering that would force the city to change for good. Progress, law, and respectability were steaming into view. The railroad was coming. Our investigators have revealed how the gold rush town of Deadwood was transformed forever by a dramatic inferno. But hidden in the mountains of South Dakota, it still retained its lawless Wild West spirit. It would take the railroad to join Deadwood to the outside world. The tracks no longer exist, but our investigators will trace evidence of them in the landscape. When the first prospectors arrived in Deadwood Gulch, the nearest railroad was still 200 miles away at Fort Pierre. Sherry wants to know how people made it into Deadwood before the trains arrived. She meets Mary Kopko.
Is this something that they would have used to bring the supplies to town?
Yes, in fact, this is a wagon train, and this was one of the only ways that people could get into Deadwood during the summer of 1876. They had to come off of the mountain down into the gulch.
Wait, all the way up there with this, carrying supplies, coming down there?
Yes, and they actually would have to skid all the way down into the town.
You know, it's incomprehensible to me to think that something like this was the only way that the people of Deadwood were getting supplies to maintain their daily lives.
And in fact, another thing that they had to bring into the gulch was all the mining equipment, which was very heavy and very costly to bring here.
Wagons continued to supply goods, but soon the infamous Deadwood stage took over as the main means of carrying people to and from town. This journey was beset by the dangers of attack. American Indians and masked road agents targeted the coach. Armed guards sat beside the driver and watched over the precious cargo.
It must have been really dangerous riding shotgun on one of these.
It was treacherous, whether you were transporting people or transporting gold.
They actually transported gold in these things?
That's what Deadwood was all about, getting the gold out of the gulch.
The stagecoach delivered $60 million worth of gold bullion between 1877 and 1890. That's $2 billion today. Transportation from Deadwood was big business. The Black Hills had been a formidable obstacle to the pioneers and mine owners. And now they were an obstacle to the railroad. Getting into Deadwood would be a major engineering challenge. Workers had to get across the valleys and rivers. They used an interlocking system of timber trestles to create bridges that stretched up to 700 feet in length. Chris meets railway historian Rick Mills to find out how they got through the mountains.
They would have had to blast through here, you know, to get through here, and it was just amazing how they did this.
You can see it on maps, but you don't get an actual feel for it until you see where they actually had to go through the work of crossing bridges, blasting their way through these trenches to make these cuts. It's just like in the mine, in the open pit mine that we saw. And actually, if you look over here, we'll just see you can see where there was the drill mark from where they actually drilled through here. Where they would have packed this full of powder and then blasted it out, blasted all the rock away to make this cut.
Mine technology was being used, but the gold wasn't in the rock itself. It was in the rails. Whoever controlled the railroad would control the gold going out. In 1890, a competition raged between two rival rail companies, one coming in from Whitewood and the other coming up from Edgemont. Both had Deadwood in their sights and were desperate to be the first to tap its riches. But the route from the north had one mountain that was just too big to blast away.
Well, this is it right here. This is the last tunnel that the Northwestern had to construct getting into Deadwood.
Look at the timber work they used here. I mean, this is just like they use in a mine, but at a much larger scale. They'd use the wedges on the top, just like in a mine.
Yeah, and you can see where the steam locomotives, where the exhaust of smoke was up on the timbers here.
Yeah, you can see that right along the top.
Chris and Rick head further into the tunnel looking for clues.
Look at the height of these sets. I've never seen timbering like this in a railroad tunnel before.
Well, when you consider that freight cars are sometimes as much as 14 feet high, as well as the width you require for a railroad, it's just amazing that it's been preserved quite this well.
Hey, check this out over here, Rick. This looks like an old tie from when the train used to be coming through here.
Oh yes, it's a regular cross tie. It looks like it's one that was hand hewn.
Okay, yeah, you can see where the track used to sit, and here the piece of rail, and here's the spike that would hold the rail down.
Yeah, definitely 1890s.
This railway sleeper is just one of thousands that were laid between the towns of Whitewood and Deadwood. As they go further into the tunnel, they find more evidence of how it was constructed.
So what do you make of this, Rick?
This would be some tin sheeting they put in to minimize sparks from steam locomotives along the roof line.
You can see in the center where it's more rusted. It must have been where the heat was.
Most likely, yeah, and you can see evidence of it all the way down here.
We can now recreate the tunnel that first connected Deadwood to the outside world. 1,300 feet in length and 20 feet high, this tunnel was a major feat of engineering that ensured the victory of the railroad from the north. Thousands of workers achieved this using simple technology. In total, the two railroads constructed 5 tunnels, nearly 250 trestle bridges, and laid 116 miles of track through the mountains. And they did this in under 1 year. These railroads have now gone, but they changed the shape of the hills and gullies. And they also changed the shape of Deadwood. Sherry meets Rick back in town to see if there's still evidence of this transformation.
So from what I understand, there's not a whole lot left of the railroad, but it looks like there might be some evidence here that there is.
Yeah, this is one of the more heavily used pieces of track in Deadwood, and remarkably, it's the last one that you can still find evidence of. It was paved over in 1983 when they quit using the track, so it's kind of remarkable it's still in place.
Yeah, you can see the paved area over here, and yet it looks like history's trying to reveal itself to us here.
It's trying to come back to us.
Remarkably, the first passenger station still survives.
Okay, so right here, this is the platform. What would we be looking at?
Right here would have been the main track that came in from Whitewood up this way,
okay,
up to the tracks we saw before. Right here was the main line.
Okay.
And then there was a siding there, another siding, and then over where the highway is now is the main line that went up into the mines above Deadwood. So it was just a maze of tracks in here. And this is one of kind of the nerve centers of the area.
Okay, so if I come over here and go, I'm right here, where am I?
You're on the siding, I'm on the main line. And then there's other tracks still in back of you, but there'd be a lot of interaction.
It's pretty cool, and we're passing each other back and forth?
Exactly. Now, those two rails make all the difference.
These rails transformed Deadwood. They brought people and technology into town like never before. This station became the town's new center. The first train from Whitewood pulled into view on December 29, 1890. On the very same day, the Indian Wars were ended, with the massacre of more than 150 American Indians at Wounded Knee Creek. The world of the original Deadwood was finished. In exploring this world, Chris and Sherry have uncovered a real town that burned bright and fast.
I've discovered that the original Deadwood really only lasted for 4 short years. It grew out of nothing. Because of the gold, it exploded. It was a magnet for people like pioneers, outlaws, and opportunists.
They've discovered that it was constructed against the law, that it was molded by men of violence, greed, and opportunity, that fire razed it to the ground in 1879. But finally, that its own success eclipsed its reputation as the wildest of Wild West towns.
The mines in Deadwood were an incredible feat of engineering. It's hard to believe that another massive undertaking, bringing the railroads into Deadwood, would end the era that made the town famous.
Everything that made and broke this town has disappeared in the space of only 130 years. Yet our investigators have discovered the clues to rebuild this, the lost world of Deadwood, Sin City of the West. And because the hillsides were covered in old trees and dry brush, they called the valley Deadwood.
With all these people out here, you know, there were obviously Indians still here. Did anybody do anything to protect the people who are obviously coming out of here in masses to search for gold?
Yes, actually General Custer came back.
Oh, now he comes.
He came back to protect the settlers at this point by fighting the Indians.
And obviously a large battle ensued after he came out here. As a little clash?
Yes, the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
The number of prospectors increased. The Indians intensified their attacks. A showdown was inevitable. The Battle of the Little Bighorn would go down in history. Here, on June 25, 1876, Custer's troops faced a larger force of better trained, better armed warriors. He died along with all of his men. And yet for the Indians, victory proved disastrous. The U.S. response was to pour men and guns into what was now a full-blown war. By the end of the year, the Lakota Indians were forced to sign over their Black Hills territory to the federal government. Deadwood acquired legal status as a settlement. That didn't make it a safe place to travel to. The Lakota continued. Deadwood, South Dakota, once the black heart of the Old West. Hidden under its modern streets lie traces of a city of sin. A place peopled by gunslingers, outlaws, whores, and gold prospectors. A city that would be consumed by fire. Our investigators are traveling back to the time when Deadwood was born.
130 years ago, I'd be stepping knee-deep into mud, manure, and sewage.
They'll walk streets that were meaner than any in modern America. They'll enter a maze of abandoned mines. They'll explore the technology the prospectors use.
So what they do is they take this hammer, this hand steel, smash away at the rock.
They'll follow the tunnel that eventually brought order to a town that lives on chaos. Using original documents and the very latest archaeological evidence, they will rebuild the lost world of Deadwood, Sin City of the West. These are the Black Hills of South Dakota. They rise up from the Great Plains of the Midwest. In the summer of 1874, this was a place of peaceful woods and rivers. But the peace would soon be gone. Within 2 years, the town of Deadwood had exploded into existence. These hills became a battleground.
Counties all laid out and named, and on this side of the Missouri River, it's empty. There's nothing there except rivers and the Black Hills.
The United States effectively ended 200 miles to the east of the hills, across the Great Plains.
Now this was Indian territory, correct?
Yes, it was.
And right smack in the middle is Deadwood.
Yes.
That must have posed a problem with the military obviously protecting Indian land, and yet there's still people coming in.
Absolutely.
So what caused people to trespass on Indian land?
Oddly enough, the military.
In the summer of 1874, a new force came riding into the mountains. It was headed by Lieutenant Colonel Custer. He wasn't there to protect Lakota territory. Far from it. His was a military reconnaissance mission. In a creek 56 miles south of where Deadwood now stands, they panned for gold. When they found it, they saddled up and rode away. Word spread throughout a country in the grip of the worst economic depression that it had ever known. The stampede towards the Black Hills began. In less than a year, 4,000 gold diggers had arrived. Still operating outside the law, they made their way to what is now Deadwood Gulch. They built a rough encampment of tents and cabins. Its layout can still be seen in the streets of today's town. And the reason was gold. Our investigators Chris Murley and Sherry Monahan are here to uncover the world created by Deadwood's gold rush. Chris is a mining technology expert. He explores and maps abandoned mines.
What I want to do is find out how they extracted the gold from the hills and how they transported it out of here.
Sherry is a Wild West historian. She wants to find out what was here on the eve of the gold rush and to reconstruct how it all began.
It's hard to imagine that in 1874 there was nothing here but wilderness. By the fall of 1875, there were clear indications of a mining camp. In the spring of 1876, the town of Deadwood had sprung up. I really want to know what got this all started.
The town you see today has undergone massive transformation. The creek that men once mined for gold has been covered over, and the city of legend has been destroyed by fire. Sherry has heard that explorers came looking for gold long before the rush of 1874. Her first port of call is at Deadwood's museum, where she meets curator Arlette Hansen.
Do you have any evidence that shows life here before the gold rush?
There's actually quite a bit.
Great.
One of the most important ones is this. It's called the Thone Stone, which records in sandstone the story of 7 men who came out here in 1833.
Wow. That's quite a lot before the Deadwood rush.
Yes.
This stone was discovered in the 1870s. Pioneers found it on a wooded slope 10 miles from Deadwood. The man who carved the words failed to make it out alive. This rock became his tombstone.
So what happened to them?
Well, it reads, got all of the gold we could carry, our ponies, all got by the Indians. I have lost my gun and nothing to eat, and Indians hunting me.
Explorers braved the hills in their quest for gold. But this territory was not part of the United States. It was American Indian land. According to the Fort Laramie Treaty between the U.S. government and the American Indians, the Black Hills belonged to the Lakota tribe. The hills were sacred to the Lakota. Their warriors would kill to defend them. And the U.S. military had promised to keep settlers away. There should have been little to attract them. It was an empty land with bitter winters. The terrain was tough. It had no roads. It was hard to get in. It was hard to get out. But the few that tried and succeeded brought tales of gold.
This is a great collection of maps. Can you sort of tell me what the area looked like before the great gold rush happened?
There wasn't much here. As you can tell by this map, the Missouri River was the edge of America. Here are townships and